On that, we have brought to you today a true authority on robotics and driverless vehicles. He was named one of the most intriguing entrepreneurs by Goldman Sachs. He's on Recode's list of 100 tech influencers. He's written several award-winning, notably award-winning, short stories and novels, but that is not what encompasses this man. He, perhaps first and foremost, as we always do, need to know that he is a U of M alum, where he finished first in his class here back in 1994. Then he went on to a small school in Boston, MI something or other, where he got his MS and his PhD. He was an NSF fellow. He directed the robotic mobility group. His research produced 150 technical publications and 50 patents. Co-founded the world's first autonomous vehicle startup in 2013, way before it was cool, if you will, and has led through that company through its acquisition in 2017. He now serves as the president and CEO of Motional, and he's making driverless cars vehicles a safe, reliable, and oncoming reality. So please help me welcome Karl Iagnemma.
Can you guys hear me? All right, well, it's pretty awesome to be back here at Michigan. I graduated class of 1994, which makes me 27 years old. I haven't been back here in a while, so appreciate the chance to talk with you guys. I am the president and CEO of a company called Motional. I realize most of you probably don't know what Motional is, so we prepared a video.
This morning, Hyundai Motor Group and Aptiv's autonomous driving joint venture announced their official name, Motional.
All right, what do you guys think of the music? Thumbs up, sorta, sideways. So Motional's an autonomous vehicle business. The goal is to make autonomous vehicles like you saw in the video available on Uber network, Lyft network. So next time you open up your app, you've got an option to call one of our cars and we'll take you where you want to go, and it'll be safe, it'll be reliable, it'll be efficient, all those things. So that's what we're doing today. My entrepreneurial journey, and I think the reason I'm talking to you guys in this class, started about 10 years ago. So here's a little bit of my history and business history. So I started a business called Newtonomy in 2013. So 2013, now I'll tell the truth, I was 40 years old. I'd been working in the academic world for about 15 years. I thought I would stay in the academic world for my entire career. I loved it. It was a great job. You had total freedom. Nobody cared what you did. But the stakes were also pretty low, if I'm being honest. So at some point I said, well, I'm building this technology. It looks pretty interesting. How can we make this bigger? And so the idea was, let's start a company. The company was called Newtonomy. So 2013, I think we were the world's first startup to focus on autonomous vehicles. At that time, Google, had a car on the road. It was pretty cool. That was an inspiration for us. But we said, let's see if we can make a business out of it. 2013, so 2016, we developed technology for a couple years. We decided to show it off to the public. At that time, there had been a lot of articles in the media written about autonomy, but no one had actually experienced the tech unless you were a PhD, actually writing code. So we said, let's make it open to the public. We did that in Singapore. We said, you can sign up, you can take a ride. It became a huge deal and kind of captured, the public imagination for one media cycle. And that sort of put us on the map. We got acquired by a business called Aptiv in 2017. So we'd raised about $20 million from venture capitalists, East Coast, West Coast, some in Southeast Asia. We sold the business for about $500 million. We joined Aptiv. We were convinced at that time we wanted to join a bigger business because we thought we needed bigger partnerships, more resources. All that turned out to be true. Aptiv's an automotive tier 1 supplier. So we continued to build our team within Aptiv. So I continued to lead that business. We went from 2 people at founding to 120 people at the time of the sale, and then we continued to grow and grow. We partnered with Lyft along the way. That was in 2018. In 2020, now we're about 600 people. We decided we needed to partner with an OEM, a car maker, and we found a great partner in Hyundai. All you guys know who Hyundai is, of course. So we formed a joint venture with Hyundai, meaning Aptiv and Hyundai teamed up. This was in 2020. We called it Motional. You saw the cool video. And then we kept going since then. So this brings us to 2022. We've got partnerships now with Lyft, with Uber. Our big year is next year, where we're going to have a driverless system in Las Vegas. We're now about 1,400 people. That video was a little bit out of date. The value of the business when we formed the joint venture was $4 billion. So we've continued to grow, continued to build technology, and it's been a pretty cool ride. So we're going to talk about that today. The kind of the rubric that Eric gave me had these different subjects. The first one was try. And for me, try was about getting started. And the question I asked myself, what inspired us to start this business? What inspired me to leave this job at MIT, which, like I said, was fantastic. I couldn't see myself retiring there. And what was the vision that convinced me, like, hey, here's $1 billion business waiting to happen? So I'm going to show you what that is. Here's the video that was the inspiration. It's awesome, isn't it? And there it is. This is Singapore, 2012. That was Damien, great kid. This is, you'll see in a minute or two, my co-founder from MIT, and these were his students and his technology, a fellow named Emilio Fazzoli. He had a student group in Singapore building this tech, and that is, it's a golf cart with a bunch of sensors literally duct taped and cable tied onto the golf cart. And it's cruising around Western Singapore, as you can see by the video, passing T-junctions, negotiating pedestrian crossing, and if we're being honest, kind of like barely working, all right? But this was the beginning. We looked at this and we thought, this is actually really cool. Because even if this only works kind of sorta today, if we invest in it and we keep developing it and we keep working on it, eventually this could be your driverless Uber or your driverless Lyft. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous to look back at this video because it was so far from reality. But, the try part, that's about a leap of faith, right? And it's also about doing something new. The most exciting thing about this video is that at this time, in 2012, there was almost nothing like this in the world. Very few systems like this existed. So it was something fundamentally new. And the easiest way to start a business is just to do something new. Competition is hard, but something new, look, there's a million ways to fail, but if you start out by doing something new, you're starting on third base. So we thought, all right, let's start with this. So now the risk part, and I'll give you some advice. If you start a business, you want to minimize risk. That's my great advice for you today. And there's many dimensions of risk, right? There's technical risk, there's product market fit risk, there's sometimes regulatory risk depending on what industry you're in. Ideally, you might have risk in one of those areas. In our case, we had risk, major risk, I would say, significant risk in 4 areas. And I would say continue to have risk in all of these areas. Technical risk. We're trying to develop technology for autonomous driving that's enormously complex. Hasn't been done before. So there's risk there. Commercial risk. Look, ultimately it's a taxi service, but there are some very new dimensions to it. New partnerships, a lot of new technology that adds a lot of costs. How are we sure we can make a viable business out of this? So that's commercial risk. Regulatory risk. We didn't know if we could actually put these vehicles on the road, if the regulatory agencies would allow us to do that. There was risk that they could just say, no, you can't do it, or that the process to get a permit will take so long that we run out of runway. So there was risk there. And then lastly, consumer risk. We didn't know, and we're still not 100% sure, but we're pretty sure at this point. We didn't know if people would want this technology, if they'd want to use it. So there's consumer adoption risk. So why would we take on all of this risk? Why would we start a business in the face of all of these different dimensions of risk? And the simple answer is, there's a huge opportunity here. So there's a huge opportunity. First and foremost, there's a big business opportunity. Look, anytime you start a business, the goal is to generate revenue that's in excess of your cost, to make it a viable business for the long term. And the great thing about autonomous vehicles, there's a huge commercial opportunity. By taking a driver out of a car, we unlock this massive reduction in the cost structure, and so we should be able to generate profitable revenue. And we see this as almost a $50 billion opportunity by the end of the decade, which is not that far away. That's great from a business perspective. From a societal perspective, I think the benefits are even bigger. So we know that this technology, with all these sensors and all this complex computation, it's actually going to be much safer than a human driver. Fantastic. You guys might know statistics, 40,000 or so people dying on the roads every year. It's a crazy number. So we know we can cut that number down by putting automated vehicles on the road. We think we can give people better access to transportation. These cars will go anywhere. They're not like bus routes. We think we can provide more sustainable transportation. You know, our cars are electric. Having large electric fleets on the road, it's a great thing for the environment. And just generally speaking, we think we can improve people's quality of lives through autonomous vehicles. You sit in the back of a car, you get your work done, you hop out, you continue on your day. It's a great vision of the future of transportation. And lastly here, just as to wrap up this intro, the do part of it, I'll show you a snapshot of what we're doing today at the business. You probably haven't seen a car quite like this before, and that's because this is really the first of its kind. This is a robotaxi built on the Hyundai Ioniq 5 platform. So that's the Ioniq 5 base vehicle. It's a battery electric vehicle. And all the stuff you see on it that's been mounted to it, those are sensors, and those are Motional technology. We haven't built all the sensors. We've specified that sensor configuration, worked with partners. We pulled it all together. We've got a computer in the trunk and our software running on that computer to enable this to become a robotaxi. I think it looks pretty cool. Certainly, it doesn't look like anything else you've ever seen. So we wanted to do something distinctive, and this is where we ended up, and it's pretty awesome. So this is the car. This is the system we're developing today. If you go to Las Vegas today, you could hail one of our cars with your Lyft app. You just open the Lyft app. It'll ask you if you want to opt in to the robotaxi service. You say yeah. And then if our car's in the area, you can call it. We'll come pick you up. We'll take you where you want to go. We've given over 100,000 rides. Those have engineers in the car today, just kind of monitoring the system. But from 2023, as you can see on this chart, we're going to have a fully driverless system that'll be launching in Las Vegas. So we are super excited about that. If you're in Santa Monica, you can get a meal delivered from Uber Eats. So we are starting small in a few cities. We're going to expand city by city. My hope is that in the coming years, will be a bunch of other cities and possibly even here in Ann Arbor. So quick introduction. Look forward to chatting with Eric and hearing your questions. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Karl. Appreciate that. It feels like we're seeing a shift in the future of AVs from one where full autonomy is what's being prepared for to one where it's more of a reduced, kind of lower degree of automation. Is that the case? Is that wrong? If so, why?
Well, in the auto industry, you know, it's kind of an interesting moment. There's been a big introduction of autonomy, I would say, in parallel in what we call lower levels of automation, which are basically driver assistance systems. So these are things like automatic braking systems. You don't notice the car in front of you stopping, and your car automatically brakes. That's one track, and that's making a lot of progress. Like every model year, vehicles are sold with increasingly sophisticated driver assistance systems. It's great. It makes the car safer. And in parallel, there's some groups that are doing what we're doing at Motional, which is developing a fully autonomous system. And it's designed to essentially have no human supervision at all. And if you can pull that off, you can do something really powerful. You can send the car out into the road with no one in the car. So why would you do that? You do that if you wanted to operate a mobility service, a taxi service, basically. If you wanted to deliver goods with no one in the car. So that's actually powerful because it unlocks a completely different business model. So on the one hand, with driver assistance, it's a feature. You're making the driving experience better for a driver. On the other hand, with fully driverless, you're unlocking a completely new business model. So from a commercial perspective, pretty different. There's a lot of progress happening on both tracks.
The progress that's happening on both tracks, what are the individual threats to both of those routes? You talked about technical and regulatory and commercial. Specify the two different threats that are most present for each of those.
Well, it's pretty different. For a driver assistance system, I would say the technical bar is a little bit lower because you have a driver in the car where, let's say this assistance system gets something wrong. There's what's called a false positive. It breaks when it shouldn't have, or it doesn't break when it should have. You still have a driver there who's going to step in and do the right thing, right? So you can tolerate some degree of mistakes. With the driverless system, your tolerance for mistakes is far lower. So there's more regulatory scrutiny. There's going to be more potentially liability and risk there. And so there are different standards. It's fundamentally a different problem. But again, we're kind of making progress on both tracks, which I think is good for drivers, people who want to buy a car with more sophisticated features. It's good for businesses like us, which want to unlock this completely new opportunity.
And the progress that has been made on both of those is, a long time period, of course, as you kind of showed, starting in 2013 with the work that you were doing. When you think back to that, what was the most meaningful milestone for you as an individual?
Well, there was one, I talked about it briefly. We launched this service in Singapore. So I'll tell you how that happened. So we launched our business in 2013. It was pretty small. We were probably 40 or 50 people at that time. Other people started coming in to the industry. We had some competitors, a few startups, some larger competitors, some that were connected with bigger businesses. In particular, Uber had an autonomous driving unit within their business. They said, we want to solve autonomous driving so we can have our own in-house autonomous Ubers. And so we were chugging along. At one point, we saw something in the media where Uber said, we are going to start opening our systems to the public and let them experience the technology in a couple of months. And we sat there, and I thought, I was CEO, I thought, well, we can do that tomorrow. And that seems great. Like, why aren't we doing this? Like, we should do that. And so it wasn't exactly tomorrow. I told the team tomorrow, and they were like, no, we can't do it tomorrow. But we set a goal for 3 weeks. We said in 3 weeks, we're going to open this service to the public on a limited basis, not anyone, but we had a white list. Hundreds of people signed up, and we did it. So we were able to give rides. And I remember going to sleep that night. Singapore is 12-hour time difference. I remember going to sleep that night, and we were launching the service that day, and I remember waking up, and I can't remember. I've never had more emails in my inbox in one morning than I did that morning. And I was refreshing and watching it. It was just email after email coming in from media outlets around the world. And the story of this, public robotaxi launch was covered, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, by virtually every major media outlet in the world. And it was a big deal for a startup, because we're sitting here as a 50-person startup that nobody's ever heard of, half our team in Singapore, for God's sake. And all of a sudden, you're covered in every media outlet there is. So it really put us on the map. It made fundraising quite a bit easier, to say the least. It opened a lot of doors for us. But it also showed, I think, our team that, look, we can do something that's unique. We can do first. We can be the first in the world to do something. We got something really powerful here. So that was a big moment for us in the startup phase.
Two questions kind of coming off of that. So the students get to hear from speakers every week who have had these rapid, fast-growing startups. You talked about the media opportunities, the fundraising opportunities that came off of that. What's the other side? When you experience that kind of growth overnight and you have that kind of sensational situation, what do you have to prepare for?
On the other hand, look, there's growth and then there's growth. So our growth was pretty fast, but it wasn't like some businesses. So we went in 2013, it was 2 of us, right? By 2014, there was probably 4 of us, or 5. We started off, we spent a year just trying to figure out what we wanted to do. I think we did a government sponsored project as a way to bring in some revenue because we hadn't raised any outside funding yet then. And then we started hiring. Now, the thing is, there's a proportionality effect here. When you're small, when you're 4 people, when you go from 4 to 8, I mean, you doubled. And doubled is a big word, right? So even just adding those 4, actually, it felt like a lot to add those 4 employees. So rates of growth are tricky. Now when we're 14, we'll add 4 people on any given day, and you don't really notice. But when you're small, the rate of growth, it's tricky. People ask sometimes, they say, well, is it hard to manage a business of 1,400 people? And my answer is usually, it's like having 1,400 kids. But that's kind of a joke, it's not totally true. It's actually not that hard compared to when you're smaller. Because when we were 40 people, so think about 1,400 versus 40, managing a 40-person startup for me was much harder. And the reason is because when we were 40 people, we had no HR department, we had no recruiting department, we didn't yet have a general counsel, we didn't have legal counsel, we didn't have any of the people that really makes the business run. And as CEO, like, makes your job easier. So you got to do that all yourself, right? So you're 40 people. As a CEO of a 40-person startup, you are the head of HR, you're the head of legal, you're the head of finance, maybe you've got a finance person, you're the head of talent acquisition. So you're trying to do all this stuff, and it's a lot.
I can only imagine. Looking back, knowing what you know now, what would you tell yourself in 2013? How would you prepare to experience the growth that you had over the past, almost 10 years now?
Well, I don't think I'd change anything. I mean, we got incredibly lucky. Ultimately, luck plays a huge factor in all this stuff. So I mentioned at the beginning when I was showing that video, the best thing you can do is do something that no one else is doing, because it allows you to screw around for a year and figure stuff out and still not fall way behind. That's what happened to us. Some people were kind of catching up, but we didn't, massively lose ground. So you get a little bit of tolerance for mistakes when you're first. It's very hard to be first, of course. It's hard to do something unique because you are the one figuring stuff out for the first time. There's a lot of cost there in terms of effort and sometimes in dollars. But the big benefit is you can go out and introduce something that people haven't seen before. And that's always something that's going to open doors and open eyes. I'm
glad that you talked about the notion of being first, because one of the things that we're often hearing from our guests is the notion of being able to either be a fast follower or, of course, guard against them. Having come out of the gate first as you did, what did you do to prepare to guard against those others who might come up and take advantage of the market from you?
And look, there's a million paths to success for sure, but from my perspective, being a fast follower is an easier route when you're a bigger business, right? You've got resources, you can wait, you can see what someone else is doing, and then you can accelerate, and you can kind of turn on the gas and try to catch up. When you're a startup, being second or third or fourth as a startup is pretty tough, because you come into a conference room with a VC or a partner, and they say, the first question they always going to ask is, what makes you guys different and better? And how are you different than so-and-so? And it's a hard question to answer. It seems like it should be the most obvious question in the world, but it's often a pretty hard question to answer. And if you don't have an answer to it, you're in trouble. And so when you're first at something, you don't get that question, because they're asking the other guy, how are they different from you, right? Because you did it first. So, being able to avoid that question is powerful. But just having the resources, to be a fast follower as a startup is difficult. You don't have the resources of the bigger organizations. You can't, right? You're a small startup. What you have as an advantage is the ability to be nimble and to do something that no one else is doing. Like, that is your only asymmetric advantage. And if you don't take advantage of it, it gets tougher.
For the students who are thinking about being founders or even trying to end up doing something novel in the AV industry, if you were in their shoes and you were in Michigan now, what would you recommend, or what would you steer yourself towards to try to differentiate and to try to put yourself in a position to either be first or to do something novel? How can they enhance their experience or their education in order to do that?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's tough. I don't have a ton of great ideas. I'm not a serial entrepreneur. This is the one thing I know how to do. So I think it depends on the person. I think, like, from my perspective, the way I kind of got into the entrepreneurial area, started a business, is because I knew one thing very deeply, right? So I went deep in one area. I did a PhD in robotics, so I knew robotics really well. And that technology, I was kind of joking about it, but that was, with no joke, obviously extremely cutting edge technology. Recognize that this was something that didn't exist in the market, and then grab that. This is what I know, I can do this, I understand exactly how it works and how it might evolve, and take it to market. So that is one path. I think for students out there who are domain experts in something, that's a clear path to starting a business. You do a master's degree in something, you do a PhD, you don't even have to do that necessarily, but you know one area very deeply and you see something new, and then you jump on it. The other path, though, there's a lot of people in the audience that are probably non-technical. Look, most founders are non-technical. You certainly don't have to be a technical founder even to found or co-found a technical business. Not at all. We talked about this earlier. What I see a lot is I see a lot of non-technical founders that they don't have the disadvantage of having focused on one thing their entire life. They're surveying the landscape and they say, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? But then they don't know how to do it. But the good news is you can go find someone that knows how to do it. So you can find a co-founder that is a domain expert. A lot of times there's domain experts out there that don't have much interest in running a business. They want to do the technology, God bless them. So you partner up, and that's a way to start a business.
It was Emilio, your co-founder.
Emilio, yeah.
When you were partnering up with him, what was it that was complementary? What did you recognize that he brought to the table or had that supplemented?
He's way smarter than I am. So Emilio's like one of the smartest guys I've ever met. I know robotics, but Emilio, invented half this stuff. So we thought at the beginning, we said, all right, we'll be co-CTOs. Awesome. And then it was like, well, who's going to be the CEO?
How'd that go?
So at some point we realized, someone's got to be the CEO. And he's the better CTO. So that's how that decision was made.
Okay. And your preparation for CEO, I would envision, or I would have to imagine, goes back to your pre-Autonomy days, back to the early 2000 days when you were a writer, where you kind of dived deep into the opportunities to write. If you could, maybe talk to the students a little bit about what it is that you wrote, why you wrote it, and ultimately what impact it had on you being a CEO.
Yeah, no, I can talk about that. But actually, what prepared me better for starting a business was being in the academic world, which may sound kind of strange. But as some of you guys may know, if you're, let's say you're an engineering faculty member or a research staff member like I was, what you're doing with most of the hours of your day is doing research. And you're doing research on problems that are useful. And one of the ways you know they're useful is because someone is sponsoring you to do that research. A company or the government that typically you've written a proposal to, also known as a pitch, you've said, I think this is really interesting for your business and you should give me funding in the form of a grant to go off and research it. And sometimes the pitch is in person, sometimes it's a proposal, whatever. And so you're convincing people to give you money in exchange for services. Like that's what academic research is, I'm sorry to say. And that's fine. It works really well. It's a good system. It's not that different from small business entrepreneurship, right? You're doing pitches all the time as an entrepreneur. You're convincing people that if it's a VC, they should invest in your business. If it's a potential employee, they should come work for you. So you're telling that story. You're constructing a narrative. And so that experience, transitioning from MIT as directing a research lab, where we had an operating budget, we had staff and all the rest, to running a startup was really very easy. Now, once you get to a certain scale, all bets are off. The biggest my lab ever was at MIT was probably 20 people, 20 students. And once you get up to 50, 100, you're in uncharted territory. But you mentioned the writing. So before I was at MIT, and actually, while I was at MIT, while I was here at Michigan, my first career, what I thought I was going to end up doing was to be a fiction writer. And so I was in engineering at Michigan, but any engineers in the room, maybe it's changed, but we could take 3 classes. I think there were 3 classes we could take that were non-engineering.
Is that still the case?
Maybe not. Something like that. I remember these 3 classes because I really treasure these classes. So I took 3 writing classes, and I thought I'm gonna actually not do this stuff anymore in the engineering. I'm going to be a writer. And so I wrote, when I was a graduate student, I wrote my first book of short stories, which got published. It was great. And that was a great experience. And I wrote a novel, and that was also published. And I thought, maybe I'll be a writer. It turns out it's actually harder to make a living as a writer than it is as an entrepreneur. So that didn't totally work out. But I would say the one thing I carried with me from that, which was very powerful, is writing is only about telling a story. Like, that is the thing. That's all you're doing. And if it's not a good story, people don't read the book. And if it's a pretty good story, they keep reading. And when you're forming a company, I don't know who said this. I should know. It's a good quote. But someone really smart said something to the effect that the best narrative wins, right? So the best story wins is another way to put it. Now, it's not to say you can have something fraudulent or that doesn't work, and you can lie about it, and that's going to bring you to success. It's not that. But it's to say that if you're in a crowded marketplace, if you're trying to cut through the chatter, if you're trying to explain your business, no one really cares about technology or your business model, at least to first order. When they first meet you, they want to hear a story about how what you are doing is going to change their life. Like, that's what people really want to hear. And so being able to construct that story, like, that's an important thing. And then when you start a business and you have employees and you have these people looking at you who actually depend on you because they've got kids and they want to be able to pay for their soccer cleats, and like, this stuff gets real, that story is equally important, because if they lose confidence in that story, if they lose confidence in you and that business, they're going to go somewhere else, or they're going to get depressed and anxious. It's not going to be a good scene. So, the importance of that narrative, that doesn't go away. It only gets stronger as the business scales.
That's fascinating. I want to read a quote I was talking about. You talked about to write or to accomplish research, the dedication and willingness to work when inspiration isn't there is just mission critical. How does that apply to being a founder? Because oftentimes we hear folks talk about that you have to have the intersection of market opportunity and passion. If you don't have passion, then ultimately you should probably consider alternative options for your career.
I mean, I think it's just another way of saying it's kind of a grind. You got to put in the time. You read the Three Sigma stories, like the outlier stories, Elon Musk saying, well, you got to sleep in the office and all that stuff. I don't know that you need to do that, but you got to put in the time. You've seen the other extreme. I have, at least. You meet founders who it feels like something they're doing on the side, and they're kind of hedging their bets by doing something else. And I think that decreases your likelihood to succeed. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. Could you still be successful? Maybe you could. Maybe it's something you're doing 4 hours a week, but you discovered something unbelievable, and you get a patent, and off you go. But generally speaking, especially in the beginning stages of your company, when ideally you've got some idea that's new, that's fresh, is something new to the world. Nothing new to the world ever stays new. So you've got a time window. That's the way to think of it. You've got a window of opportunity to take that idea and actually transform it into a business. Because an idea is not a business, it's just an idea. And so that window, that's where you got to put in the time, even if the inspiration isn't there, even if you get up in the morning, you don't really feel like it, even if it feels like a grind. That's the part where you got to power through it. The comment was really more about the writing side. People, I think, sometimes, you imagine creative types as people who, when the mood strikes them, they go and they paint a canvas, or they write a few pages of a novel or something like that. In my experience, it was really the opposite. You would go into the room, with your laptop, and you'd sit there. And some days you'd write something, and some days you'd write nothing. But the point was actually to sit there, because you didn't know, like, when a good idea was going to come along. But when it did come along, you had to be there to catch it. Because if you weren't there, it's gone. So that level of discipline, which I think for some people is maybe a bit surprising when it comes to creative work, that level of discipline is really important.
That level of discipline, you and I have talked before that you find it actually harder to write a short story or a book than in managing a company or growing a company the way that you have. Students who want to go and enhance their ability to be good storytellers and craft a narrative, what can they do to practice that muscle and to build that muscle, practice that skill set? What have you done over the years to enhance that in yourself?
That's a good question. I mean, you got to be interested. I think recognizing the importance of it is one thing, and actually working at it and kind of honing it. I mean, not everyone is a natural storyteller. I don't really consider myself a natural storyteller. There are so many writers that were so much more talented than I could ever be. But spending the time on it and recognizing that it's a thing and a thing that matters, I think that's most of it. Like I said, you don't have to be, a fantastic creative type to be an effective storyteller, but putting value in it and recognizing that it's one of the things that will unlock success. I think that's very important.
Going off of that and diving a little deeper into the writing that you've had, a central theme and a central question, it seems like, to a lot of the stories is the balance between reason and passion, between those forces impacting a character in one of your stories. Can those two forces always exist in a startup in a way that's balanced? If so, how do CEOs or how do founders keep harmony and balance with them?
Honestly,
what have you done?
I think it's pretty easy. Like, look, as a startup, assuming things are going well, like a startup is like a family. It's great. Everybody loves each other. People are usually happy. And like I said, especially if things are successful, awesome. I mean, our attrition rate as a startup was like 0. I think like 2 people left for different reasons, and that's fine. And then, things change, right? Once you get to be a big business, let's say you get acquired and join a bigger company, then it's a little bit different. I mean, then it's like high school. It's like everybody has to be there. They don't necessarily like each other, but they got to tough it out. So it's a very different feeling. So you go from the family feeling to the high school feeling. So like building a culture as a startup, I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's important. There's a saying, again, I'm terrible with attributions here, but this is one more, I don't know if I fully believe this, but it's a provocative statement that I read, and it's success is 80% of culture, which is another way to say if things are going well, often the culture comes along for the ride. Now, there's the flip side of that, which is actually kind of interesting, which is, I think, a more interesting statement, which is to say, how do you maintain a good culture when things aren't going well? And that's actually really important.
How do you do it?
Well, I think what you do in part is you build up a reserve of good culture and positive energy during the good times, so that when things aren't so well, you can draw on that. And that's part, a lot of it just through leadership. It's instilling faith in your team and creating trust between you and them, so that when things don't go well, you can say, hey, trust me on this. Things are going to be fine, and here's how we're going to get through this. This is the strategy, and then people will follow you. So you do the work, when the sun's shining, so that when the rainy day comes, you can reap the rewards.
Sounds very Midwestern of you.
Yeah,
Appreciate that work ethic. Yeah. All right, we'll kick it out. Some student questions here. We've got Sebastian and Meghan over here.
Hi. Here?
Go ahead. Yeah.
From my perspective, that even the techniques is good, but it seems there's a lot of things to do to make it come true. I think it comes from the politics pressure, that how to persuade the government to, like, people drivers have the driver license, how to get a driver license for the autonomous vehicle.
Is your question on how do you persuade government regulation?
How to face the politics, or how to persuade people to trust the techniques?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, on the government side, it's interesting because every country, and in the U.S., every state is different. And some states today are really supportive of the technology. They say, if you want to do it, fantastic. In Las Vegas, where we have driven, over 1 million miles, super supportive. We have a great relationship with the government. We've had a great safety record there. That certainly helps. But basically, you go through a pretty simple process. They make sure you're a legitimate operation, then they say, all right, you can start driving. Different states are different. California, it's a much longer process to get to a driverless system. So one of the answers is, there are many parts of the world today that are supportive of autonomous technology, and the easiest path to market sometimes is to go where you're wanted. Sometimes it's that simple. We say, okay, if it's really hard to drive our cars over here, we'll go over here where it's easier. From a customer adoption perspective, I think that was the second part. How do you convince people to want to use the technology? It's kind of interesting. What we found was that a lot of people, when you get into a car like ours, and you see the steering wheel turn by itself, and you realize that software is driving the car, people often get pretty nervous. Not going to lie. Sometimes the reaction is like you start kind of holding on to the handrails, and it's a kind of an uncanny feeling, because It feels very much like a human driver. It's very smooth and comfortable. It's like a skilled human driver, but there's no one driving the car. But what we found, and this is over thousands and thousands of rides, is that if the car is safe, if it's comfortable, and if it more or less drives like a person would drive, very quickly people get comfortable with the technology. And I mean on the order of minutes. So we give people a ride in Las Vegas, and let's say it's a 50-minute ride. The first minute or two, you see some anxiety in some cases. And then at minute 5, people are looking at their phone. And by the time they get out of the car, the most typical comment we get when we say, how was your experience? They say, it was kind of boring. And that is the greatest compliment we can ever receive from anyone, because it means it was safe and it was just like any other trip. So I'm optimistic about the consumer adoption. I think our job will be to get people into the car for the first time. And once we get them in that first time, then they'll have a good experience, and they'll come back a second time and a third and a fourth.
Show of hands, how many people have ridden in an AV here?
Oh, it's a lot.
Okay, decent amount. All right, thank you. Next question.
Kind of relating to what was said earlier, like how did you find Las Vegas as like a starting point for Motional?
Las Vegas?
Yeah.
Well, you know, they have that saying, what happens in Vegas? No, that wasn't it. But it actually goes back to this question. So Las Vegas was one of the, I would call them like early adopter cities for autonomous vehicles. They were one of the first cities and states, Nevada, that had a clear process for getting a true permit to drive autonomous vehicles on the road. It's an application you would put in. It was actually similar to like a driver's license permit. And you would, give some information about your company, the testing you've done, and then they would issue you a specific license plate that said autonomous vehicle. It's a pretty cool plate. You put those on your car, and you are authorized to drive in Las Vegas. And I think more broadly in Nevada. So again, kind of going back to this comment a minute ago, we saw that and we said, well, here's a place we can go where the path to market, the path to testing is very clear. We understand it, we have faith in it and confidence. And it seemed like they were welcoming our presence there. And so that's where we got started. Singapore was pretty similar. 10 years ago, Singapore was one of the few countries in the world that was talking about autonomous vehicles. Singapore is a small place. They're not going to grow geographically, but their population continues to grow. And one of their big questions is, how do we make our transportation network more efficient? Because we don't want to build a lot more roads. I mean, it's very valuable real estate in Singapore. So keep the same number of roads, move more people. And we explained to them, we think autonomous vehicles can be very efficient in the future. And they believed it, and they became very supportive of what we were doing.
It's fascinating. Another question over here?
Yeah, so you talked about the importance of believing in the narrative. And so as you grow, you talk about your company being acquired as well, and as you grow a number of employees in your company, so how do you maintain that belief in your narrative as your company grows from dozens to hundreds to thousands of employees?
Yeah, I mean, the narrative changes all the time. I mean, not every day. You don't want to give people whiplash. There's consistency. But, let's say on a regular basis, I mean, we have yearly updates, obviously. Every year you're making a budget, you're defining objectives, but possibly even more frequently than that. You are telling people a story about how what you're asking them to do, what your objectives are, is going to lead them and the entire business to success. And if it's just the facts, like that's not a narrative. It's hard to rally people around facts. You have to rally them around a story. And that's what I mean by the narrative. That's what I mean. It's a broader context about how what they're doing is going to have an impact, and not just on earning 14% more revenue, but on society, like the slide I showed. And I believe all that stuff. Like all that is true. I mean, these cars will be a lot safer than a typical driver. Typical drivers are distracted by their phones. They're not paying attention some of the time. People are driving impaired, like all of this crazy stuff. None of that's going to happen with an autonomous vehicle, obviously. Other things can go wrong, sure. But by the time we're releasing the technology in its like fully fledged form, it will be very, very good and very, very safe. So that's an example. That's part of the narrative. People resonate with different things. And for some people, it might be this, what I'm saying here about safety. For other people, it might be around deploying green fleets and helping the environment, right? Getting away from a fossil fuel economy and an internal combustion engine-based fleet. So it really depends, right? There's elements, there's threads to the narrative, but it evolves, it changes as the business changes. It changes as your objectives change.
Kind of, do you have another? Yeah, go ahead.
You said that starting a company, it takes like a lot of effort and you need to spend a lot of time on it. So when you first started your company, what did you have to like sacrifice in order to sort of like dedicate yourself?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I didn't really think about it so much as sacrifice. And this, I mean, it was a lot of fun also. So I really enjoyed all this stuff. I love what I'm doing. You know, it was, before I was doing this, I was working pretty hard doing other stuff. So when I was writing books, the second book was when my daughter was young. She was a newborn. So the only time, she would wake up at like 6:30 in the morning. So the only time I had free to write was between 4:45 and 6:30 in the morning. So that's what I would do. I would get up at like 4:45, and then I'd start writing at 5, and I'd write from 5 till 6:30. And then she would wake up, and then it was, you know, then it was back to reality. So, I mean, you know, on the other hand, there's a lot of hours in the day. So I don't think I sacrificed anything, personally. Through all the time we were starting the business, and now, not including travel, and there was quite a bit of that, but I was always home for dinner with my family. We'd do that like every night. And sporting events, all that stuff. Like there is also this myth that you have to be like a lunatic and a monster and ignore your family, and I don't think any of that's true. I think if you do that, you're probably doing it wrong.
That's a phenomenal point. I want to close out with kind of a last thought here. So outside of the AV industry, if you could put yourself at the helm of another and kind of let it move over to a similar role in another industry, what would it be? What interests you? What other industries do you feel like have the opportunity for growth and social impact the way that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the biotech space in general, life sciences, and the intersection with computation, I think that's really pretty powerful. I say that knowing nothing about almost anything about that industry, but from the outside looking in, the way that drugs have been developed in the past versus the way they'll probably be developed over the next 50 years, it seems like there's a massive opportunity there.
And I lied, I'll have one more question. And that is, you've spent your life, at least the majority of your life and career, in an academic setting, around academics, around research. You have an appreciation as a former professor of what it's like to engage with students. What pearl of wisdom would you give them about what is unique and what is special about the window of time they have as an undergrad? What do they not realize now that in hindsight you wish everybody would know by the time they graduate, or experience by the time they graduate?
I mean, I don't have any real wisdom there. What's the saying? Youth is wasted on the young, which is not an insult at all. It's just to say that when you look back as an old person, like I am, you kind of wish you could be younger, because knowing what I know now, you might do things a little bit differently, or you'd appreciate it more.
What would you do differently?
No, I don't know. I was just hypothetical.
Oh, okay, just make it.
But as as an undergraduate, that's like, it's the greatest time, because you've gone through high school and all the stress and anxiety and pressure of that, and you're actually doing something you enjoy. And if you're not, you change. And it's just this great period where you have a lot of freedom. That's ultimately what it boils down to. You have a lot of freedom. It shouldn't be a lot of pressure. I mean, you guys are here in this entrepreneurship class. It may be that some of you will, after you graduate, undergraduate, start a company right away at age 22 or 3, and fantastic. There's no pressure to do that either. I mean, like I said, I started my business when I was 40, after I'd learned a little bit about a few things and felt I was ready to do it. I think everything you're hearing now, not just in this class, but outside, you carry that with you for the rest of your life. And you draw on it at different times of your life. But yeah, you get jealous looking back, because it's also just a lot of fun. Yeah. I mean, you guys are going to go to the football game tomorrow and all that stuff. I mean, you get old, that stuff doesn't happen anymore. Sorry to say.
Can't stay up as late.
Sorry to be depressing on a closing note, but enjoy it while it lasts.
Thank you. Appreciate making the time.
Thank you. Thanks.